Hi, I'm Theodore Shapiro, and we are here to talk about music for picture and all things related.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you inviting me over to your studios.
My pleasure.
So I guess to start off, I'd love to know kind of how you got started in the business, or just not started in the business, but started with music. What was I guess, from your childhood, or how early on did you get started in music, and when did it kind of evolve into filmmaking, into movies?
Right. I started writing from a pretty early age. I was studying classical piano
Mm-hmm.
from an early age, around 5 or 6, and and I thought of myself as a composer from a young age.
Uh-huh.
I would sit at the piano and noodle around and make stuff up. And so I thought of myself as a composer even before I was really actually writing anything.
Right.
And that was something that I always just assumed was a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents certainly reinforced the idea that was just a hobby.
So your
Um,
parents weren't musicians,
well,
did they?
my neither of my parents are musicians.
Uh-huh.
My mom's parents were both not professional musicians,
Right.
but music was very important to them, and yeah, I don't want to give the impression that I wasn't encouraged to be
Right. Right.
musical,
Yeah.
because I was certainly encouraged to pursue it, just not as a
That's a
profession.
profession.
Yeah, and yeah, but then as I went to college and in a slightly larger pond of people, I still I loved doing it, and I still felt like it was something. I still looked around and felt like, oh, this is something that I
Right.
do as well as other people,
Yeah.
and so I just continued.
So when did it become were you writing just your own compositions for a performance, or were you? Did
I
you?
was writing. I was writing music for a lot of music for theater.
Mm,
When I was in college, I did a lot of theater as an actor,
mm-hmm.
and also music for theater. I wrote a musical. I wrote a lot of incidental music, and
Right.
that was just that was what I was doing. And then I started doing a little bit of writing for film
Right.
in college, and just got my very first taste of what that was all about.
But were you aware of film music while you were in that space? Or were you aware of it going on as its own thing, or did you kind of happen upon it going, oh, I didn't realize I can apply myself to picture composition
I was
versus
definitely aware of it. I
yeah.
mean, yeah, I mean, from an early age, I Raiders of the Lost Ark was
Right.
very
Yeah.
important to me as a kid. That was the seminal movie of
Yeah.
my childhood, and the music was a big part of it. I mean, music was my main focus all
Yeah.
throughout high school, and so certainly film music was something I was keyed in on, and I wasn't a soundtrack fan,
Yeah.
but it was something I was aware of. I was aware of the
Right.
Bernard Herrmann scores for the Hitchcock films. I was aware of you know Chinatown.
Mm-hmm.
That score made a big impression on me as a kid, and then and John Williams
Right.
was really important.
So what would you have, I guess, what was your big, if you could put it on a timeline, your big break that was like, I I got a good job, I hired on a movie, and then this is kind of setting me on my path to become a
Right.
full time kind of a
Yeah,
full.
yeah. Um, you know, it it feels like there were a number of steps that were small but significant steps,
Right. Yeah.
and not one where it felt like, oh my God, this is it.
Uh huh.
I got hired. My first feature was a big deal,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that was just for a film that was an NYU student's thesis film,
Mm-hmm.
and but it turned out it went to Sundance, and it got
Wow.
won a bunch
Yeah.
of awards, and it was a big
Yeah.
um, you know in the microclimate of film festivals, it was a big deal for a second,
Right.
and that was important, in terms of getting me on my way. And you know, I got hired to do State and Maine, and that felt like a big deal just because it was the first movie that I'd worked on, that had stars
Yeah.
in it, and that was a big difference from anything that I had
Right.
done before, and working with David Mamet, who
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. Huge.
was a very significant artist who I was 28 when I got hired to do that movie,
Wow.
and I had been studying his work in college, which wasn't that long before that.
Yeah,
So that
so
that felt like a really big deal. And then first I started getting studio films, and
Yeah,
that
right.
and that was significant, and so but it's they've all felt like little steps as opposed to
Yeah,
like one
big.
giant. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that you worked with David Mamet, and I think you've created some really great relationships, I think, with directors and producers
Yeah.
that have kind of lasted. Of course, Ben Stiller and
Yeah.
John Hamburg
Yeah.
and Paul Feig
Right.
recently.
Yeah.
And what do you think is the key, I mean, to building those lasting collaborations? Is it just getting along personally with that person, or is it just knowing how they work? Because a lot of people are looking at John Williams and Steven Spielberg
Yeah.
and this kind of long last, or Bernard Herrmann and
Yeah. Yeah.
Hitchcock. So, but you're kind of creating these relationships that are slowly going along, and
Yeah.
you guys are creating lots of rewarding work from it too. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
is there anything that you've learned throughout the process of what makes it work, or is it just works?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm a very collaborative person by
Right.
nature, and uh, I want my directors to be happy, and I like and value the process,
Mm-hmm.
and I value the idea that if you mesh creatively with somebody, and you go through this trial together,
Right.
then you're gonna you'll walk out with something that you're proud of,
Right.
and it will it's not just the product of one composer.
Yeah.
It's not that model of the Western genius composer, locking himself in a dark room
Yeah.
and coming up with with a brilliant score. It is, it's a true collaboration, and a film composer is a filmmaker first and
I
foremost.
know, that's storyteller. Yeah.
And so it's something that I think that when you approach it that way, and you engage in a rewarding way with the director, then
Right.
that's what the foundation for the relationship is.
And you've done a couple films with Ben Stiller.
Yeah.
How's it working with a director that is also an actor? And I'm sure he has to have a lot of trust in you because he is juggling multiple hats.
Yeah.
Whereas because you scored a couple films where he starred in.
Yeah.
Is that how you met? Is that how he got a hint of your music? Or
That is actually exactly
Really?
right. Yeah. So there was one period of time where I did Along Came Polly and Starsky and Hutch
Right.
back to back,
Mhm.
and he noticed the scores in both of those movies and liked them,
Right.
and then shortly after that he produced Dodgeball and was involved in getting me on board
Yeah.
for that, and so that was how it started, and then after Dodgeball there was just he started calling on me to do
Right.
stuff, whether he was producing or
Or
directing,
directing, yeah.
and it's continued.
And I mean, Walter Mitty is, I think, one of your best works. My
Oh,
personal
thank
favorites.
you.
I thought it's such a beautiful score, and you really tapped into that character and the theme and everything there is. It's wonderful. With now that since you're working with Ben and he kind of is pulling you onto his projects,
Yeah.
do you start working on stuff in pre-production? Are you part of the process, or do you?
Yeah.
So is that something? Do you prefer?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with it's interesting with The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. He got me involved very early on,
Mhm.
and in fact, when they were making that movie, they had a break in production. They shot a bunch of stuff in New York, and then they went to Iceland.
Mhm.
I think I've got that right, and
Right.
not backwards, but and and so he had me come to New York while they were taking the break, and he showed me some stuff, uh, and it was in, and then he went to Iceland and was sort of off the grid for a long time.
Yeah.
And it was in that period of time when, they gave me one scene to look at, and I just had time to take one scene and try a couple of different approaches to it.
Yeah.
And that is actually what led to, I wrote the main theme sort of in that time period, and it was just enormously helpful. We came right out of the gate with something that we were both really excited
And
about.
how did the idea for the kind of the humming come along? You worked with
Jose Gonzalez.
yeah, and that became such an integral part of that the theme, and it kind of gave it kind of a human connection to it. Was it something that you brought him in for? Did he kind of improvise it, or what was the?
It was something I think that Ben and I both started talking about independently. I mean, I think that I think I knew that there was that there was like an indie sound that he was looking for.
Oh, right, yeah.
And so we both liked the idea of working with an artist and incorporating their their voice, their sound as part of the score.
Right.
And Jose was somebody who I'd been a fan of for a long time, and Ben really fell in love with his music, and it was just perfect. It was a perfect fit because he's such a great guy and was so easy to work with and so flexible,
right.
and he's just a lovely person, and I think that his spirit. I mean, his spirit is so incredible. It's one of these things where you write, I could write a cue,
Yeah.
and then I'd send it to Jose, and once his voice was on it, there was like a magic to it that wasn't there before, and so it was, on a personal level, on a creative level, it just kind of couldn't have been better.
Yeah, it's an amazing. It's one of my favorite scores of like last 10 years. It's really great.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, I'm proud of that too.
Yeah. All right, yeah, we're rolling. So you've done a lot of different kind of genre blending of scoring. You've done horror comedy, and then action comedy, and then just comedy, and then kind of romantic comedy. Well, somehow comedy's always kind of been circling around, though. Did you ever find yourself typecast into that kind of genre, how did it end up becoming kind of go-to for the action? Comedy?
I mean, well, in part it's because I have good friends who are collaborators who work in comedy.
Yeah.
John Hamburg is one of my closest friends. We went to college together. I've done everything that he's ever done, I think. Certainly every feature he's done.
Yeah, and they're all hilarious.
And they're all great. So and I had another friend. Another one of my first jobs coming out of college was that I worked on this MTV, a TV show called The State, which was a sketch comedy show, which had a big cult following, and that in turn also led to the people who worked on that did Wet Hot American Summer, and there's a whole sort of thread of work that came through that.
Right.
But in a way, I mean, I there's so much typecasting in the industry, but one of the stories that I tell is that I think that the way that the typecasting really began was that I did Old School, which was a real success,
course,
and then once you've done a successful thing, then it's safe to hire you for another thing that's like that thing.
Right.
But the way I got hired for Old School was that it was on the basis of the score for Heist, the David Mamet film, which of course had nothing at all to do in any way with Old School, and it's and that's a score that that I'm proud of, and I like it, and it's just ironic that nobody's ever hired me to do another score like Heist. I did get hired on the basis of that to do Old School.
But I what I love about your music is that it's you score kind of these comedic films, but there's always such an emotional undercurrent that you put in your music, and you find a way to kind of break genre boundaries. And it's not, I mean, the way you approached Tropic Thunder, for instance. If you listen to that score on its own, you could have plopped that down on Black Hawk Down, and it would have been a perfect war film. And I feel like you've kind of cracked the code of how to make music connect, but work in a comedy, because I think comedy is probably one of the most hardest genres because if you make the music funny, then it kind of doesn't work.
It's terrible.
Are Saturday morning cartoons the only place for funny music, or is there a room for funny music in, say, a big budget action comedy?
I mean, never say never, but I just don't. I don't see how funny music really ever works. I mean, even in animation, it's still. I mean, I don't know. I haven't done an exhaustive study, but I just find that when the music plays it straight, and the comedy plays in dissonance to the tone of the score, it's just funnier, and
it heightens it. I mean, like Zoolander, it was like an espionage score.
Right. Right.
Exactly.
It
made it so much funnier.
Well, I mean that is it's funny when I started working on Zoolander. Or Zoolander 2, what I felt was that, the music that I was writing had to not only be serious, but it couldn't even be serious in quotes, like satirically serious. It had to actually be real, and the more serious and, without winks it was, then the funnier the material became. And, I think that particularly, in a good comedy, you really want to maintain the tone, and breaking the spell, I think, breaking the spell even briefly is really damaging, I think, to the tone. Like, on Spy, for example, if we had done one, James Bond guitar chord, sort of as a wink, it would have completely broken the tone. And I don't, you only have to do that once before people start feeling like, oh, it's a send up.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think Spy is a send up.
No, I mean, I actually just watched it recently again. It was on HBO. Me and my fiance sat and watched it, and of course we loved it. And it's its own thing.
Yeah.
And even though the movie, it's Spy, and she's holding a gun, kind of in that pose and everything, but the movie itself never felt like. I think Jude Law's character maybe a little bit kind of was the James Bond archetype.
Sure, yes.
But the movie itself, never was like, we're a James Bond spoof. It wasn't like Spy Hard,
Right, exactly.
So you did do work on a pretty big film this year, Ghostbusters, which got a lot of attention, of course, and I'm sure you've talked about it a lot online and everything. But before I do want to touch on that a little bit, but just working on Ghostbusters as a film, you worked with Paul on Spy, and of course we're brought on to Ghostbusters. Was there a lot of pressure on this one because it was a reboot of such a beloved franchise, or did you kind of try to block that out and be like, I'm just scoring a comedy, an ensemble comedy, action, horror? I mean, it became that action, but it was a kind of a gothic little bit.
I mean, what's the genre? It's a comedy, horror, action. It's definitely
you can't really put a label on it.
I mean, I'd like to say that I wasn't aware of the stakes. I mean, but I certainly,
of course,
I felt like a big deal, if I was ever unaware of it, anytime I told people what I was working on, they would say, "Oh, that's a big deal," So, but at the same time, yeah. I mean, I did a lot of sketching, and I really wanted to come up with a tune that I was happy with, and and so in that sense, I definitely felt some sense of what the stakes were.
Right.
and they were certainly swirling all around while we were making the movie. But for the most part, I would really say that the creation of the score was a very satisfying collaboration with Paul.
Yeah.
In the same way that it had been with Spy, and it did not ever feel like there were, a million cooks in the kitchen and people were saying, oh, we got to have more of this, or
Right.
what, it felt very much like, it felt very much like a satisfying collaborative process. And I mean, we knew from the beginning that integrating some element of the Ray Parker Jr. tune was going to
Right, and I
be
was about
that was
to
going to
ask,
be part of the.
was that a decision that came from the studio, from you, or from Paul? Was it where that idea kind of started?
I think that we all just knew
Just felt
that
it
it
was
had
right.
to be.
Yeah,
I mean,
of
I
course.
think that if anybody's position had been no, I'm not doing that,
Yeah.
then it would have been a problem.
Right.
But I think, we all knew that it just had to be part of the picture.
Right.
I work with Ludwig Göransson, who's a very talented composer who used to be my assistant, and now he's a wonderful composer in his
Right.
own
Yeah.
right, and he works in this building. And I had been sort of talking to him and when he was working on Creed and sort of looking over his shoulder at what he was doing, and it was just so clear, just from my own vantage point, that you needed to hear those themes
Right.
from the original
The
Rocky.
classic ones,
You needed to hear it, and the way that they ultimately cracked that puzzle of how to integrate it, I thought was so successful.
Right.
And so I walked into this experience knowing absolutely, like, that's really the right kind of approach, where we don't want to, it's not going to be everywhere.
Yeah, I don't want to oversaturate.
We're going to have our own theme, but but we are definitely going to
Yeah.
deliver
Right.
that thing that people clearly want and associate so closely with the material.
Right. And it's interesting because there's so many. I mean, reboots and remakes are kind of their own thing now, and there's a lot of people who are very anti the remakes and everything. But I really enjoy seeing stories retold from different point of views
Right.
and different filmmakers and different, they're people's favorite stories. And
Yeah.
throughout time, good stories get retold.
Yeah.
So, but just to get Terminator, I talked to Lauren about reusing the Terminator theme.
Yeah.
All these really iconic things that kind of you can't really separate them from, like, you kind of have to use them and
Right.
and incorporate them. But it's tricky though, because you do want to make your own statement. Your own thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's there's an interesting little piece of scientific information that somebody told me, which is that you use a different part of your brain when you hear music that you are familiar with than the part of your brain that you listen to music with when you are unfamiliar with it. So in other words, when you're unfamiliar with a piece of music, you're using the puzzle solving part of your brain.
Okay.
When you're familiar with it, you're using the pleasure center of your brain.
Oh, okay.
And it makes perfect sense.
Right.
When you hear something and you know it, there's a certain satisfaction and joy to it
Right.
that is just, you don't have that when it's new. When it's new, you're figuring out
You're processing
you're
it.
processing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I don't think that the answer is that all movies should only be scored with material that everybody knows before,
Yeah.
but it's a useful piece of information, and
Right.
I was certainly on board with the idea.
And it was, I mean, when you used it for the big Times Square sequence, it was perfect.
Oh, cool. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
that was really one of the first cues that I scored.
Yeah.
In the process of writing the score, and so right off the bat, we understood, okay, well, this is where this idea is headed. This is
Right.
going to be the high point of this arc
Yeah,
of
exactly. I love
integrating that theme
How it built to it, yeah, and then
so,
it exploded, and it was awesome. You also used, I think, a very underrated instrument is the organ, which is
Oh yeah.
outside of, I think, Hans Zimmer's Interstellar, which kind of just put it on the map all of a
Yeah.
sudden. It's only been isolated to horror or maybe even for religious kind of
Yeah.
overtones or stuff like
Right.
that. And you used it here kind of in a horror aspect, but it really became this pretty significant part of the score too
Yeah.
in certain areas. Do you find the organ as a very adaptable instrument? I mean, have you used it anything else
I've
besides?
never used it
Really?
before. I learned a lot about the instrument
Yeah.
writing this
It must have
score.
been, yeah, it must
It
have
was
been
incredibly
interesting. Yeah.
cool. And recording a live organ is just an awesome experience. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes an amazing sound,
Yeah.
and it makes a sound that is, it's the size of an orchestra. So
Right.
so when when you're writing for organ and orchestra, it's really a massive amount of sound that you're dealing with. Um, you know, ultimately, this score, we were in the action sequences. We were dealing with such a massive amount of sound effects.
Right. Yeah.
There's just so much, and those guns are just, they just eat up so much of the sonic spectrum, and so
Yeah.
another benefit of the organ in this case is it really cut extremely well, and it gave us a fighting chance against
sound effects.
against some of the sound effects. Yeah.
Just and I mean that is I've talked to other composers who it is a challenge because are you part of the process when it comes to the mixing? Is that a composer's job to go to the mix and make sure your score is well represented? Or
Yeah, sure.
so,
I mean, it's generally the way that it works is that you come at the end for final playback,
right.
And then you can give your notes. I mean,
Do they listen? I mean,
oh yeah.
in some
I mean,
cases where they'd be like, get out of here.
I have not. I have never found that they didn't care about
Right.
what
That's
what
good.
I thought. you know, and ultimately, like I don't think that that you win just by having the music as loud as possible.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No,
so
you can drown everything out.
yeah.
The negative thing. Yeah.
So I was pleased ultimately with the mix. I mean, you certainly can hear more of the score by listening to the soundtrack than by watching the film.
Right.
That is undeniably the case. But I thought that they did a good job with a difficult mix of making everything hurt.
So I mean, we're talking about Ghostbusters and the process and everything, and now kind of on the other side of it, when it kind of was presented to the public, there was, of course, a lot of dialogue going back and forth about the all-female cast, and then people started saying you're ruining, like, this is not what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, and then again, that kind of goes back to my point where I love seeing remakes. I love seeing different takes on stuff. But what do you make of the? It's just fans are very defensive about their movies. What do you kind of take of that and make of it? The response that it got.
It's hard for me to. I've never heard a ton of vitriol about any of the reboots of Planet of the Apes or Spider-Man or any of the. I mean, there's projects being rebooted and all the time, and this happened to be the one where people went bonkers.
Right.
So it's hard for me not to think that there's a component of misogyny that's built into the reaction. And look, at the same time, it doesn't make me happy that people felt like their childhoods were ruined.
God, I hate that word. I hate that
this,
that term. It's
so dumb.
The original doesn't go anywhere. That's my point. It's like the original's not getting. No one's coming and pulling
exactly,
it off your shelf and like
exactly.
snapping it in half.
Exactly.
It's like you have to watch this one for the rest of your life.
Exactly.
It's I don't know. It's just it cracks me up just trying to analyze. I mean, it interests me because people are just like, oh God, and they just jump on it like that. And then there was it kind of evolved into the whole racial thing with Leslie Jones. I don't know where that came from, and it points out some ugly things in society. But I mean, in the end of the day, the film I thought was so well made, and you guys did such a great job. And,
thanks.
And even though I hope they greenlight a sequel, but it was I think one of the most enjoyable summer films I went to this year.
Well,
So
I'm glad you felt that way. I mean, I really like it, and
yeah,
I think that at the end of the day, Paul realized his vision, and
yeah,
I think that uh, I think he's a fantastic director.
yeah,
I love his sensibility. I love the roles that he's writing for female characters, uh, and like I think whether or not they make a sequel, and I would be delighted if they do. I think that the movie succeeded on its own terms,
yeah.
and ultimately, that's. I mean, it's hard not to be aware of the financial considerations and all that
Right.
stuff,
Yeah, yeah.
and but I'm really proud to have worked on the movie, and I think that it really did a lot of what it set out to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of maybe talk a little bit, t- uh, talking about your just your process in general, not just for any specific film.
Yeah.
When you approach a movie or anything for the first time, what's kind of the first thing that you look for to kind of start getting the first note out of your head?
Yeah,
Is it characters? Do you look at maybe just the style of cinematography, the color palette? Is there anything that what really plays to you?
I mean, any of the above, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
I think that I often start out by thinking about instrumental palette, and what I can do, in terms of the instrumentation that will give it a unique identity,
Right.
and then thematically, just I start thinking about that. Um,
How do you know when you got the theme? How do you know when it's right? Do you
um,
go through like multiple variations?
for sure,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, sometimes it's just the first idea is the one.
Yeah. Is there anyone that was you hit on the first try?
Um, let's see. What can I? There's probably something. I don't know. I mean,
Walter Mitty. I love the theme. How long did it take to get to that? The humming, the da da, that kind of the.
I wrote three tunes for. I wrote three tunes for Walter's main theme,
Uh huh.
and I'd already written two, both which I liked, uh, and then I I I still hadn't heard back from Ben because he was off in Iceland filming. So I wrote a third,
Uh-huh.
and that was the one.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't think he'd go for it. I
Oh.
thought that I'm so accustomed to being pushed in a lighter direction.
Yeah.
So I just reflexively assume that anything that's more lyrical is going to be the one that I like the most, but
All right.
doesn't get accepted. And I was sort of thrilled and surprised when that
Yeah,
was
I
the
mean,
one.
they really marketed that film as almost a comedy, but I felt that it was a very deep character study. I thought it was because
Yeah.
Ben is a comedic actor, of
Right.
course, so everyone is like, oh, Ben Stiller, goofiness.
Right.
But I mean, the film itself was very moving, very touching.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a beautiful film, and
Yeah.
I watched it recently with my kids, and it holds up very well.
Yeah,
And
for
I
sure.
think that that's a movie that is gonna wear well with time.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. And in terms of other genres, is there stuff that you haven't explored yet that you'd like to? I mean, is there a bucket list that you have set up? Like, I would love to score a space epic. I would love to score a western or
I mean, I I would say I would say that I I connect very strongly to my own childhood.
uh
Um, so just so for sure more movies that kids would want to watch.
yeah,
And ideally, not just comedic ones.
right.
And so
Well, you did
that
a
would be
really
my
good one
answer.
with Marley and Me. I think you've probably made every single human being cry.
Well, that is a very effective movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I feel like I certainly have some, memories of experiencing movies like E.T.
Right. Of
that
course.
like they're never gonna make another movie like E.T. So
Yeah.
so it's not like my goal is to write a John Williams style score
Right.
like that. Not that I would mind, but it's just. But I certainly think that if I can tap into that part of who I am, that would be exciting.
And do you have time to go watch movies yourself? Do you try to absorb other people's work that you
I
don't
do, yeah.
like?
I mean, I love going to the movies. It's funny. I mean, I uh, at this point in my life, I notice the music so much
Yeah. Okay.
that it's very difficult. It's easier for me to enjoy movies that don't have a lot of music.
Right.
Um, and so it's a bummer because I'm just so aware of,
Yeah.
of everything that's happening
Because
musically.
you're a magician who already knows the act.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's
So
exactly right.
yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, there certainly are a bunch of composers film composers whose work I just admire tremendously. I'm
Yeah.
always excited to hear what they're up to.
Uh, I guess we were talking about just briefly of you kind of seeing other movies. Can you watch? I mean, you just said you just watched Walter Mitty. Can you rewatch a film and not be critical? Do you go, oh my god, I should have done this? Do you ever have regrets when you're watching your own work?
I never don't have regrets.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hard on myself.
Yeah.
So I I have a hard time not just thinking, oh, I could have done that
Yeah.
differently, and if I'd done it differently, it would have been more right. Um, but that's something I'm working on,
Do you
and
think that's a negative quality to have, or do you?
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. It gets in the way of.
Well, I probably would have been. I'm sure it puts me in good company with other composers.
I've heard. Yes, I know a lot
Um,
of composers who are very critical. I mean, they're the worst critic of their own. Yeah.
Yeah. But as a parent with two kids who are similarly self-critical, um, i it's something that I take less pride in. It's not a great way to be,
Yeah.
and so I'm working on it.
Well, I'm letting you know you don't have to be too critical on yourself because your work is quite
Oh,
fantastic.
thank you.
But just kind of maybe a little, just to wrap up, looking at the industry as it stands right now, is do you think the film industry is in a good place right now? A lot of I know there's a lot of critics that are saying it's a lot of just studio pictures, and we kind of lost touch with more of the smaller, uh, you know, more intimate and long-lasting pictures. Everything
Yeah.
is just franchise.
Yeah.
What is your take on it? I mean,
It's hard for me not to agree with that. I mean,
Yeah.
I just think that, I think that just the business model has just leaned so heavily towards huge
Right.
tentpole movies, and there's so much in the marketplace. There's no time for movies to be discovered anymore,
Yeah.
and so it's just
Yeah.
all about making movies that everybody will go see on opening weekend. And
Yeah.
I, I don't think it's weird that it's developed the way that it has. It all makes sense, but it's
Right.
just there's a reason I think that people are responding to the kind of storytelling that can happen on television right now.
Right. Exactly.
And and the things that were feature films in the 70s are, they're still happening, but they're just on TV.
As miniseries or limited
Yeah,
miniseries
exactly.
yeah.
So what's good is that I don't worry about the future of people making good product.
That's what, yeah. That's true.
There's people are gonna tell good stories, and they'll exist whether it's like it is now, where it's all sort of squeezed into awards season in this
Yeah.
little tiny bubble where those movies can exist, or whether it's on, Netflix or HBO or, wherever those things live.
Right.
But there's just a lot of good stuff to see.
There is.
And somebody's got to write music for it.
Exactly. And I know it's going to feel a little bit tacked on, but I just thought of it. Since you do work with a lot of filmmakers that you have built relationships with, do you work with temps a lot? Do directors like Ben or Paul,
Mm-hmm.
do they put a temp on and do they say, oh, we kind of want to go with this tone? Is that something
That certainly happens. I mean, I'm fortunate that with a bunch of the directors that I work with, they're really good about not going to. I mean, they use temp in exactly the right way, which is
right? They're not falling in love with the
they
temp.
understand it's a placeholder,
Right.
And look, it can be helpful if a director can say, well, there's something about the way this thing works that's doing what I need it to do.
Right.
That can be really useful information.
Right.
I try to start as early as possible because temps are really very, very difficult to deal with. I mean, I find for myself that when you watch a scene with a piece of temp music, suddenly, in your mind, it's like, oh, well, that's the only way to approach this scene. Like,
exactly.
The fingerprints are so strong,
right.
in spite of your best intentions.
Yeah.
And so, as much as possible, I try to start early, just so that you can, if you can start out with a truly blank slate and come up with something, some sort of combination of some weird synthesis that you that isn't like something else,
right.
then that's where the best work comes from,
right.
And if you can seed that into the movie and into the director's process as early as possible, then that is the best way to get to something that you're
right.
proud of.
What's the shortest amount of time you've had to work on a score?
I did a rescore once, which was I think it was 6 days of composing.
Wow.
Yeah. That was a little bit crazy, but
and there you don't really have time to second guess anything, right? You just
no,
have to go
you just keep writing.
Whatever comes first, you
exactly.
just go with it.
Yeah,
wow.
right.
Yeah,
that was nuts. I don't recommend that.
I know, but when I hear those stories, just like, oh my god, how do you guys pull it off? But just to kind of finish it off, what outside of music, I know music is your life and you make your living from it, but is there anything outside of music that you do for hobbies and stuff that kind of creatively refresh? Do you like to travel, hike, fish? Is there hobbies that are not score or film related that are deep embedded with
Let's
you?
see, what do I like to do? I like to do jigsaw puzzles. I like to read. I mean, that's I read a lot. When I'm not working, I like to walk with books on tape.
Yeah. Do when you read a novel, do you score it in your head?
No. Thank God. Oh God, what a terrible thought. Like that, I would be done. I would not read anymore if I started doing that. So yeah,
that's good. Okay. Well, Theodore, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure and insightful.
Cool.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.